Hello viewers. So in our last video we learned how to play the Queen's Gambit as black. This time we'll learn how to play the Sicilian. So there's a gambit to know about. The SmithMora Gambit is called. White plays d4 and then we take it, and they offer a pawn by playing their pawn to c3. So you could just take the pawn, but again there's some complications to worry about. The simple fix, just return the pawn, play d3. So what's great about that is that now white's pawn c3 isn't looking like a very good move anymore. It's just blocking the knight from playing out there, which is the square it wants to go to. So you are returning the pawn, white can just take it, but he's going to have some coordination issues because the knight can't go to where it wants to go. So that's the simplest fix to the SmithMora Gambit. Some people like the King's Indian attack, especially a lot of amateurs like this because it's very easy to play on the white side. So what white's going to do is play g3 and then bishop g2, castle, and after moving the knight they'll play f4 and try to get an attack going on your king. So it's a very simple solution that I still play to this day that works against the King's Indian attack and also against a lot of these attempts to beat the Sicilian. I just play g6, and then after g3 you play bishop g7, so you're kind of copying their idea, bringing the bishop out to this diagonal. And now I play e5, trying to cement our control over d4. After they castle, we'll play knight to e7, so our knight's not blocking the bishop like it would be over here. And here are the ideas we want to focus on in this position. So you'll castle, probably be the first thing you do on your next move, and you'll play your pawn over here. You want to bring your bishop out to e6 where it controls d5, but before you do that, you want to play h6 so that way you don't get troubled by knight to g5. So what white's going to try to do, like I said, is try to move the knight, then push this pawn and try to start an attack. You can just neutralize that by playing pawn to f5, so you are going to block that pawn from making any further progress. On a good day, you can also play pawn to d5 and get more control of the center. Another move to know about is the pawn to c3. White's trying to take the center, and by playing d4 and recapture the pawn, so he gets to have the center be fully occupied. The problem with c3 though is that it blocks the knight from coming to that square. So we're going to take advantage of that by playing d5. And after we trade pawns, white can't harass my queen with knight to c3. So what usually happens here is that white brings out the knight, and we can do the same thing. Then they advance the pawn, and we prepare to bring out our pieces in castle, play e6, and white will do the same thing, bring out his pieces in castle. And then we can harass our queen. We just drop back, and we'll castle here. The bishop will usually find a home on b7, so I'll play b6 and then b7 to make sure you keep this square under very firm control. So a thematic break in these kinds of positions that white wants to play d5. Not right now, of course, because the square is too heavily fortified, but at the right moment, white can try to play d5 and rip the position open, so you want to make sure that square is under lock and key. You might have to play knight b4 and knight to d5 to really reinforce that square. But the most common reply that you'll probably see against most of your opponents, they'll play the knight out to f3. So now I'll play knight to c6. The most popular move is pawn to d4, but some people play bishop b5. This is actually very fashionable at the top levels these days. So what I recommend here is playing the pawn to g6. So you're preparing to bring your bishop out and control these squares over here. So if white just castles, which is the most common move, you can play a bishop out, and if they reinforce their center, you can play pawn to e5, and now you're really cementing your control over d4. If they take your knight, you take with the pawn, with the d pawn, so now your queen also is giving you more control over that square. So you have a very firm grip in the center. You're not going to get blown away in the first 10 moves. So because black's so thoroughly dominates the d4 square and this line back here, white might prefer to play the pawn to c3. In that case, we play bishop g7. If they go d4, we play queen b6. So now we're hitting both the bishop and we're hitting the pawn over here. So white's got to make a choice. Either sacrifice a pawn on d4 or trade the bishop for the knight. So that's how you handle bishop e5. Now let's go back to the main line. So main line is pawn at d4, and we trade. And now we go for the accelerated dragon, which we learned a little bit about in the previous video. So in the previous video, I recommended that if you're white here, you want to go for the Roxy Bind, playing pawn to c4 to get more control over the d5 square. So now we'll just play bishop g7, attacking the knight on d4. So they'll defend it by playing bishop to e3. We attack the pawn by playing knight f6, and they should defend it by playing knight c3. So now what we do, I advise you to play knight to g4. You could also play castles instead. This is also respectable, but I'm going to advise you to play here instead. I think this is a bit better for black than castling. So you might be wondering, doesn't it just hang a knight? Can't white just take it? The answer is yes, but when white takes the knight with the queen, that queen is no longer defending the knight on d4. So we lost the knight over there, but we're winning it back by taking this knight on d4. We're also threatening to play knight c2 check. That'd be a fork because attack both the king and the rook. So white has to get out of check, and we just take the rook. So white's got to do something about that. Usually plays the queen back to d1. That protects the square and also hits the knight. So we should retreat to e6. And then what you should play is rook to c1 here. And we can play queen to a5. So we're probably not going to take the knight on c3 at all. This bishop is actually very important. You don't want to trade off lightly. What you'll want to do instead is you're going to want to castle soon. You'll want to play pawn up here, and then you'll bring your bishop out, so your bishop has control over this diagonal. And you'll play your pawn up to d6. You've got a solid position. You're not going to get blown off the board in the first 15 moves. So that's how we handle the Roxy Bind. So in the accelerated dragon, white doesn't always play the Roxy Bind. White might play the knight to c3 instead. Here's what you do in that case. So you play bishop g7, attacking the knight, and white plays bishop e3, defending the knight. You can play knight f6. Now if white plays bishop c4 here, preparing to castle, you can play queen a5. This actually threatens to win the pawn. So you're threatening to play knight takes c4, and white can't take it because then you're moving into check. So white should just castle here. So now you can't take the pawn because knight takes is no longer check because the king is over here instead. So instead you should just castle and you're fine. You'll play your pawn to d6 to make sure that e5 never happens, and you've got a good position. Now the one thing you gotta be a bit careful about is that white can try to go for complications, but fortunately those complications fizzle out pretty fast. So white could just take your knight and play knight takes c6. And then after you recapture, they'll play pawn to e5, attacking your other knight. So what I recommend here is you actually go back to where you started, knight g8. This would be attacking the pawn, so white's got to do something about that. If white plays bishop d4, you can play queen to a5. So now you're threatening takes, takes, and then queen takes, so white will probably want to do something about that. If he reinforces the pawn with f4, then he can play f6, and now white's got to do something to resolve the tension in the center. The scariest move, at least superficially, is pawn to e6. So don't capture it. If you capture it, you're going to regret it very quickly. If you play, like, say, pawn takes over here, then they just zap your bishop and your rook's trapped, so you're actually dead lost right here. So don't take it. They play e6. Just play knight f6. And now white's attack over here just fizzles out. He's got to do something about the pawn that you're about to capture, so you're going to be fine if they take either way. So that's how you survive playing the black pieces. If you follow this advice, you have not very much to memorize, and you're going to be still in good shape after the first 15-20 moves, and you'll be able to get off to a good start. Hope you learned something. I hope I inspired you to play better chess.